The Marino Show. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Marino Show. I'm your host, David Marino, and today I'm talking to author Daemon Manx. He's an author of horror, suspense, psychological thriller, and speculative fiction. He is a member of the Horror Writers Association and the Horror Authors Guild. His books include These Lingering Shadows and Manxiety. Daemon, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I know I only listed a few of your books. You have very many, and so I'll put up your website address here. What is that, by the way?
Yeah, so I have my own personal website, which is www.daemonmanx.com, spelled just like my name is spelled. And then I have my own publishing label site as well, which is www.lastwaltzpublishing.com. And that's where anybody could actually pick up signed copies of all of my books there.
Well, I am a huge lover of horror, whether it's in book form or movies. Most movies come from books, as you know. For you, how do you approach, the writing process? I'm sure it's different every time, but also, what is it about the horror genre that attracts you to that?
I think as writers, we write what we know. I've known horror since I was a kid. Growing up, that's what drew me in. The TV shows in black and white, seeing Frankenstein and seeing Night of the Living Dead, and then going to the movies and seeing Jaws and Halloween and Friday the 13th. These movies drew me in, and I remember some of my first readings I read. Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, and I was immediately drawn. I was like, it encapsulated the feeling of autumn, at least autumn in the Northeast that we come to know, with the falling of leaves and that sense of mystery in the air, and the the approach of Halloween. And I fell in love with that idea of being able to capture that in written word. Um, and I've always been trying to do it ever since. I've just been so drawn to it. So I'm drawn to that, but it's not just horror that I write, because I think to label something as just horror, there's so much more to it. There's there's character development, there's emotion, there's love. People fall in love in horror. Uh, people have tender moments. There's coming of age stories that happen. It's immersive, and it's life. So it's art imitating life.
So your latest book is Manxiety. Can you explain what that's about? Because I love the title, by the way.
Thank you. So anxiety is it's basically it's a collection of short stories. A lot of the stories in there are based on or influenced by real life events. I've had a crazy life. My life is very much could write a horror movie, at least not a horror book. So a lot of the stories are in there take place with something about it is something I've been through. A lot of times my stories are like that. I'll write about something I've experienced it, and then take it into a find where the plot goes, because there's a little more to it than that. There's always a twist that has to happen in a horror story. Also in Manxiety, there's a couple memoirs, things that have verbatim happened to me, and there's a couple humorous pieces. And then a couple things that are just straight out of the nightmare world that I've manufactured just for the occasion.
When you talk about, some of this book really is personal and which I'm sure most of your writing, most authors, there's some part of it that's personal, but you have had, a unique experience in life, and what brought you to writing um, was maybe something that not everyone knows about you, but you had reached out to me, and I was intrigued because your journey to get to where you are today hasn't been an easy one. But I always appreciate and love when I see people who have made it through, a struggle, as we all have struggles in life, and have made it to the other side. Doesn't mean it's perfect and everything's roses, but that you were able to overcome to some extent your past. Can you talk to me about how you started writing?
Yeah, so and when I started writing, a lot of those stories that I first started when I got serious about it ended up being in Manxiety. Uh, Largely, many of the stories in Manxiety were written inside a prison cell. I spent 8 years in the state prison. Um, Prior to that, I was a heroin addict for more years than I even care to disclose. Um, I was, I was as addicted as anybody has ever been, and that led my life to the darkest of places. I came from a good home. I came from a happy suburban lifestyle, but I've always had this addictive personality. And when I found opiates, it was as if I had found this secret answer and I chased that demon as far as I could. Uh, I committed a robbery as a result of trying to feed that addiction. I always say, heroin heroin addicts are really known for their superb decision making, and my decision making led me to an 8 year prison sentence. Um, when I got to prison, I realized that this can no longer go on. I was facing years of isolation. I had let down everybody, including myself, and I was beyond depressed. Like I was despondent. I'd lost my wife, I'd lost my house, I lost a business. I had nothing. I didn't even have anybody who would actually call me or accept my call when I was in the county jail, getting ready to face sentencing. It was on a Christmas Eve. Um, I had gotten in trouble because I was still crazy inside this county jail, and I was working in the kitchen. And I took it upon myself to say, "Hey, let's try to make some hooch in the kitchen, the officer's kitchen of all places." Once again, our best decision making comes from uh, being addicted. And I immediately got caught, and I was thrown into the hole. And while I was in that hole, there was nothing to read except paperwork from Narcotics Anonymous, Smart Recovery, Alcoholics Anonymous, and I spent like 3 or 4 days like reading the same brochures over and over, and I had like this epiphany that you know this is my rock bottom. This is where it has to change, and that was when I began my journey to become sober. So I dove into that, tried to latch on to every kind of program that might help me find recovery emotionally and physically, um, and got involved with the men who brought AA and NA into the county jail system. When it was time to move on to the prison, this was about a year later, and my head was clearer. At least I was, not using. So I was having some emotional sobriety there because it takes a long time once you're coming off of opiates for your head to clear. And it takes a long time for your emotions to come back. Um, years to get over this addiction. Um, so, I was on shaky ground, but I was moving in the right direction. And when I got to state prison, there was a guy walking around knocking on the cell doors, and he said, "Hey, do you want to sign up for college classes?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do." I had never gone to college. It seemed like the thing to do. So I had to take the placement test, and uh, I did that, and I did fairly well in it, and they accepted me into the college program. And what a couple of my first classes were the English Lit and English Comp, and yet we're reading George Orwell and we're reading Hemingway. Uh, we're reading these great essays that other authors have written, and I'm like, I got to do this. I like gravitated to that so much. So I was doing well in college, and then it's time to start writing essays on our own, and I was really enjoying it. And right around that time, it was hard to get books in the prison system. And occasionally people would send me a book or two, and I got this short story collection by Joe Hill, Stephen King's son, called 20th Century Ghosts. And it was so different of a short story. They weren't the usual short stories that I'd grown reading. Not like the Stephen King short stories. These things were had a whole new flavor to them. I said, you know what? This is what I want to do. I want to be a horror writer. I want to write short stories. Maybe one day I'll write a novel. So I started writing in the prison cell short stories. And they were probably pretty terrible at first. But I kept doing it, and I kept sharing them with my buddies in there. They started getting pretty good, and they got better as I went along. And actually, a couple of those short stories ended up being in Manxiety. I named it Manxiety because that whole time was certainly filled with anxiety, was filled with a roller coaster of emotions. Um, and when I finally got released, I had a lot more anxiety about facing the real world and coming out as an author and trying to see if I could make it in this business. There's insecurity, that whole imposter syndrome. Manxiety, that's my own anxiety. Stories based on my real life struggles and written while I was going through maybe one of the darkest periods of my life. It seemed pretty fitting of a title. So
First of all, thank you for being vulnerable and raw and sharing your story in that way because I always on my channel and on the show like to talk about real things that people go through because while social media sometimes it's full of all the best things that people want to show you all the time, they don't talk about the real. We all deal with issues, whether there's something like what addiction and what you've dealt with, to just having depression, anxiety. I mean, everybody deals with something. So I think when people hear someone else talk about what they've gone through and also see the the glimmer of hope that can come out of that, I want to share that. So thank you again for sharing that. But how long after you got out? And I also have to mention before I go on, 11 years sober this Halloween.
that's correct. Yeah.
That's
We're
amazing.
Thank you. We're counting down. Yeah. So I got arrested on the 29th of uh of October. And although, I had stopped using probably on the 30th, I don't count that as a sober day because it was still like probably given if somebody put the drugs in front of me, I certainly would have done them. And I think Halloween is a lot more of a fitting day for me as a sobriety anniversary. So yeah, this Halloween I'll have 11 years clean and sober. Like, because I was that guy. I would do anything. I would go to any length to get my fix. And honestly, if anybody's out there who is that guy or is that girl, or you think there's no way it's possible, because if I could do it, if I could get clean, anybody can. Anybody
How long after you got out did you publish your first book, and how did you go about that process? Because I mean, for anybody that's doing anything for the first time, it's a learning curve, right? But how did you get it published and go down that road?
I had a plan, and I started this plan when I was in the system. I bought Readers and Writers Market. I bought Writers Digest, and I was looking at all these publishers and magazines that accepted uh, submissions, and I would study those, and I would circle them, and then when I got out, like I had a lot of work to do still because in the system I did not have a word processor. I had composition notebooks, so everything was handwritten and everything needed to be transposed into a Word doc, which I was not that familiar with. I spent almost a decade in prison. Although I'd used computers before, I was not fully up to speed. So I was going through the process of typing, getting my typing skills up, writing these all down into a Word doc, and trying to get them edited to at least the best of my ability. Which, looking back, they still needed a lot more editing than they received in the beginning. So I did that, and I got out on November 6th of 2020. Spent a couple months doing that, putting all my things into Word docs and editing, and really deciding, like, do I want to put myself on social media? Like I was scared to do that. So much anxiety. Like, I wasn't a nice guy before I got arrested. I was a real dirtbag. I did a lot of people dirty, and I had a lot of apologizing to do and a lot of amends to make. And as I was doing that, I found, people were pretty receptive to that, and that was rewarding. That was a huge lift off my shoulders to find that people were accepting of the apologies that I had to offer. Putting myself out on social media was very vulnerable. I was scared to do it. I started looking around Facebook and looking at the different horror groups on Facebook, and I saw there were tons of horror authors out there. So I took a step, and in this interim, I'm looking at magazines where I could submit one or two of my stories. So I started sending them out, and I'm sending them out with the full intention that I'm going to receive a lot of rejections, and I wanted them to, because that's a rite of passage. When you're an author, you need to have your stack of rejections so that when you get that one, it's that badge of honor. So, we get out in November. June of the next year, uh, Green Shoe Sanctuary, a magazine, an online magazine, accepted my first story. And it was a two-parter. It was called Something in the Air. It was about a couple guys who were in the prison system when the pandemic breaks out. A little bit different of a pandemic. A very true to life story. And they accepted it. They released it in a two parter, one in June, one in July. I think in August or September they accepted another one of my stories, and I had they had a contest going on, and I submitted a story called "The Dead Girl," and I came in third place for best short story. So now my confidence is a little bit more, and I said, well, okay, now it's time to maybe try to get an independent publishing contract. So I was really looking out on the internet and looking at publishers. And I had this book called Abigail, which is, it's not in this true sense of horror. It's very different. The premise is there's a child gets dropped off on someone's doorstep, and it's a very different child. And her name is Abigail. Um, so I devised this query letter, and I said, it was something to the line of, please accept my story, Abigail, as I can no longer take care of her. I know as a publisher, you'll be able to give her the proper home that she needs and will be able to be the loving parent that I can no longer provide for her. P.S. Please don't feed her milk as she is severely lactose intolerant. About an hour later, they get back to me and say, "That's the most clever query letter I've ever got. I can't wait to read your story." Um, and they accepted it like a week later. So that started it. Shortly after, they went out of business. So I said, "Huh, well, we can go looking for another publisher, or maybe we consider opening up our own publishing company." How hard could it be? How hard could it be?
I was gonna say anybody who's an indie artist of any type, whether you're an indie filmmaker, an indie musician, an author, you're putting your own money into it, you're putting your own energy into it. And I mean, the great thing is that when you get, the gifts of it, it's on you get it, right? But I imagine it's been a lot of work.
A tremendous amount of work. So, things did not end well with me in that first publishing company. They closed their doors and ended up owing quite a few people some money. Uh, so I went out and I opened Last Waltz Publishing, and I said, you know what? If I can maybe help one or two authors and maybe save them from the pain that I just went through, well, maybe that'd be a good thing to do. I can put out my work. I can put out a couple other authors. Maybe build a family here. And that's what I started. Now we're 2 years running on Last Waltz Publishing. I picked up three new authors this year. Still have several other authors who came in during the first year, and it's been great. We're not breaking down the doors, but I don't want to overextend myself. So I've taken on a handful of really great authors that I believe in, and they help me, I help them, and we're building a family.
Now, if somebody were to go to your website or they wanted to know, what am I going to get if I read a Damon Manx novel or book? I know they're all different, so I'm not trying to put you in a box, but what would you say to somebody who, hey, what's he about? What will I get out of, his books? You said you really go for the emotion, but what's something that you would like people out there to know, if they're looking to read any of your stuff that's out there?
It is not your typical type of horror. This horror is the everyday horror that we're all capable of, and we all felt and dealt with. These are the horrors that we as humans understand. The things that in everyday life. There's adultery in there. There are creature features, but there's human monsters as well. And mine my stories are designed to touch on the emotion, whether it's fear, longing, heartbreak, love, despondency. It's all in there. And yeah, I've been told this, and I do try to get this in everyone. My friend calls it the Manx moment. Um, I I I've never had someone say or be able to predict how my stories end. There is always a twist, a Twilight Zone style ending that will knock you out.
Tell me about our cranium, right? It's
Yeah.
it's now on audio, and I was reading the synopsis that it's four horror authors that kind of go at it. Tell me what it's
Mhm.
about and not giving too much away, and then tell me about the audiobook, because before the interview we were talking about how you really took a different approach in making this theatrical when it came to
Yeah.
the audio.
Yeah, so I wrote this book with Mark Towers. He's a fantastic author, and we wrote this book together. It's called Our Cranium. It's about four horror authors in the near future, very competitive. They get together once a month, and it always comes down to who's the scariest, who's got the best audienceship, and who's the best author. Well, there's no way to find out until there is a way to find out. And one of the authors tells them about this new program his company has developed called Arcranium. Arcranium is a cross between virtual reality and artificial intelligence. It allows the authors to plug into Arcranium while one becomes the storyteller with the aid of Arcranium. The other three become the players and the characters in the book. Now, what we've done, we were approached by the people from No Sleep Podcast and Lee James, a fantastic narrator, who said, let us make the audio book for this. And I'm like, okay. Uh, they put together a full theatrical presentation of our cranium with multiple characters. You've got male, female voices. You've got Australian accents. You've got English accents. You've got full backup tracks to some very brutal backup tracks, I might add, and a complete set of backup music for this. It's got its own music track to it. This thing is a brutal movie that you feel like you are immersed with. You want the headphones on because it's in full stereo. It is nearly 4 hours of gripping hell.
The thing dug its fingernails further into Alex's wrist, while the other hand began searching under the blanket.
I'm sorry.
All rational thought on hold as Alex tried to yank herself away, only succeeding in knocking the blanket to the floor. As she ran her eyes over the half-eaten mass of disgust on the bottom sheet.
Is there anything else that you want to add that we haven't talked about, or something that you wanted to get across to the viewers and the listeners?
We have covered a lot, haven't we?
Yeah.
In just a short time. No, I mean, I really, I would like to say too, touching on my struggle is I found sobriety by opening my mouth and asking for help. I was in that county jail, and at one of the first meetings where a guy came in and he was from AA, and I went up to him after the meeting and I said, do you ever like sponsor guys in the system? I mean, is that even a thing? Are you allowed to do that? And he's like, you know what? Let me talk to a couple people. Let me try to arrange things. And he set me up with one of his sponsees, a guy named Tom. Tom came in while I was in that county jail every week, and we met through the glass, talking on the phone, talking about our problems, talking about recovery, talking about sobriety. Uh, he helped me work through the steps. And if it wasn't for Carl, and if it wasn't for Tom, and if it wasn't for me opening up my mouth and asking for help, I never would have got it. And I would not be the guy who turned his life around. So if you're out there, if you're struggling, you've got to open your mouth. We've got a saying in prison: a hungry mouth a closed mouth does not get fed. So open your mouth if you're struggling.